Union budget, understanding its formulation and implications. There are three major components of the budget: expenditure, receipts, and deficit indicators. Depending on the manner in which they are defined, there can be many classifications and indicators of expenditure, receipts, and deficits. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman will present the union budget for the upcoming year on Saturday, February 1, 2025. In this article dated 31 Jan 22, Zico Dasgupta helps us understand how to decode the budget. The budget will be tabled in Parliament by Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman. Is the government's blueprint on expenditure, taxes it plans to levy, and other transactions which affect the economy and lives of citizens. Government blueprint on expenditure, taxes, and other transactions which affects the economy and lives of citizens. What are the major components of budget? There are three major components: expenditure, receipts, and deficit indicators. Depending on the manner in which they are defined, there can be many classifications and indicators of expenditure, receipts, and deficits. Based on their impact on assets and liabilities, total expenditure can be divided into capital and revenue expenditure. Capital expenditure is incurred with the purpose of increasing the assets of durable nature or of reducing recurring liabilities. Considering the expenditure incurred for constructing schools or new hospitals, all these are classified as capital expenditure as they levy to creation of new assets. Revenue expenditure involves any expenditure that does not hold to assets or reduce liabilities. Expenditure on the payment of wages and salaries, subsidies, or interest payments would be typically classified as revenue expenditure. Based on the impact on assets and liabilities, total expenditure can be divided into capital and revenue expenditure. Capital expenditure is incurred with the purpose of increasing assets of durable nature or of reducing recurring liabilities. Consider the expenditure incurred for constructing new schools or new hospitals. All these are classified as capital expenditure as they lead to creation of new assets. Revenue expenditure involves any expenditure that does not add to assets or reduce liabilities. Expenditures on payments of wages and salaries, subsidies, or interest payments would be typically classified as revenue expenditure. Capital expenditure incurred with the purpose of increasing assets of durable nature, and revenue expenditure involves only any expenditure that does not add to assets or reduce liabilities. Expenditure on payment of wages and salaries, subsidies, or interest payments would be typically classified as revenue expenditure. Wages, salaries, subsidies, interest payments. Depending on the manner in which it affects different sectors, expenditure is classified into general services, economic services, social services, grant in aid, and contribution. The sum of expenditure on economic and social services together form the development expenditure. Economic services include expenditure on transport, communication, rural development, agricultural, allied service sectors, and expenditure on social sector includes education or health is categorized as social services. Again, depending on its effect on asset creation or liability reduction, development expenditure can be further classified as revenue and capital expenditure. The receipts of the government have three components: revenue receipts, non-debt capital receipts, and debt creating capital receipts. The receipts of the government have three components: revenue receipts, non-debt capital receipts, and debt creating capital receipts. Revenue receipts involve receipts that are not associated with increase in liabilities. Revenue receipts that are not associated with increase in liability or comprise revenue from taxes and non-tax sources. Non-debt receipts are part of capital receipts that do not generate additional liabilities. The recovery of loans and proceeds from disinvestments would be regarded as non-debt receipts since generating revenue from these sources does not increase liabilities or any for future payment commitments. Debt creating capital receipts are the ones that involve higher liabilities and future payment commitments of the bank. Fiscal deficit by definition is the difference between total expenditure and the sum of revenue receipts and non-debt receipts. It indicates how much the government is spending in net terms. Since positive fiscal deficits indicate the amount of expenditure over and above revenue and non-debt receipts, it needs to be financed by debt creating capital receipt. Primary deficit is the difference between fiscal deficit and interest payments. Revenue deficit is derived by deducting capital expenditure from fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit by definition is the difference between total expenditure and sum of revenue receipts and non-debt receipts. Total expenditure and sum of revenue receipts and non-debt receipts. It indicates how much the government is spending in net terms. Since positive fiscal deficit indicates the amount of expenditure over and above the revenue and non-debt receipts, it needs to be financed by debt creating capital receipt. Primary deficit is the difference between fiscal deficit and interest payments. Revenue deficit is derived by deducting capital expenditure from fiscal deficit. What are the implications of budget on the economy? The budget has an implication for aggregate demand on an economy. All government expenditure generates aggregate demand in the economy since it involves purchase of private goods and services by the government sector. All tax and non-tax revenue reduces net income of the private sector and thereby leads to reduction in private and aggregate demand, but except for exceptional circumstances, the GDP, revenue receipt, and expenditure typically shows a tendency to rise over time. Thus, the trend and absolute value of expenditure and receipts in themselves have little use for meaningful analysis of the budget. The trend in expenditures and revenue is analyzed either by the GDP or as growth rates after accounting for inflation rate. Reduction in expenditure GDP ratio or increase in revenue receipt GDP ratio indicates that government's policy to reduce aggregate demand and vice versa. For similar reason, reduction in fiscal deficit GDP ratio and primary deficit GDP ratio indicates government policy of reducing demand and vice versa. Since different components of expenditure and revenue can have different effects on income of different classes and social groups, the budget also has implications for income distribution. For example, revenue expenditures such as employment guarantee schemes or food subsidy can directly boost the income of the poor. Concession in corporate tax may directly and positively affect corporate incomes, though both a rise in expenditure for employment guarantee schemes or reduction in corporate tax would widen the fiscal deficit. Its implication for income distribution would be different. What are the implications for budget? The budget has an implication for aggregate demand of an economy. All government expenditure generates aggregate demand in an economy since it involves purchase of private goods and services by the government sector. All tax and non-tax revenues reduces net income of the private sector and thereby leads in reduction in private and aggregate demand. But except for exceptional circumstances, the GDP, revenue receipt, and expenditure typically shows a tendency to rise over time. Thus, the trend and absolute value of expenditure and receipts in themselves have little use for meaningful analysis of the budget. The trend in expenditures and revenue is analyzed either by the GDP as growth rates after accounting for inflation rate. The trend in expenditures and revenue is analyzed either by the GDP as growth rates after accounting for inflation rate. Reduction in expenditure GDP ratio or increase in revenue receipt GDP ratio indicates the government policy to reduce aggregate demand and vice versa. For similar reasons, reduction in expenditure GDP ratio or increase in revenue receipt to GDP ratio indicates government policy to reduce aggregate demand and vice versa. For similar reasons, reduction in fiscal deficit to GDP ratio and primary deficit to GDP ratio indicates government policy of reducing demand and vice versa. Since different components of expenditure and revenue can have different effects on income of different classes and social groups, the budget also has implications for income distribution. For example, revenue expenditure as employment guarantee schemes or food subsidies can directly boost the incomes of the poor. Concession and corporate tax may directly and positively affect corporate incomes, though both a rise in expenditure for employment guarantee schemes or reduction in corporate tax would widen the fiscal deficit. Its implications for income distribution would be different. What are the fiscal rules and how do they affect policy? Fiscal rules provide specific policy targets on the basis of which fiscal policy is formed. Policy targets can be met by using different policy instruments. There exists no unique fiscal rule that is applied to all countries. Rather, policy targets are sensitive to the nature of economic theory and depend on the specificity of an economy. In India's case, the present fiscal rule is guided by the recommendations of N.K. Singh Committee report, allowing for some deviations under exceptional times. It has three policy targets: maintaining a specific level of debt to GDP ratio, fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, flow target, stock target, flow target, and composition target, maintaining a specific level of debt to GDP ratio, fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, and revenue deficit to GDP ratio composition target. The both expenditure and revenue receipts can potentially act as policy instruments to meet specific set of fiscal rules. Tax rates used within the existing policy framework happened to be determined independent of the expenditure requirement of the economy. Accordingly, in the present institutional framework in India, it is primarily the expenditure which is adjusted to meet the fiscal rules at given tax ratios. Such an adjustment mechanism has just two related but analytically different implications for the fiscal policy. First, independent of the extent of expenditure needed to stimulate the economy or boost labor income, existing fiscal rules can provide a cap on expenditure by providing imposing the three policy targets. Second, under any situation when the debt to GDP or deficit ratio is greater than the targeted level, expenditure is adjusted in order to meet the policy targets. By implication, independent of the state of the economy and need for expansionary fiscal policy, existing policy targets may lead the government to reduce expenditure. In the midst of the inadequacies of fiscal policy to address the contemporary challenges of unemployment and low output growth rate, the nature and objectives of fiscal rules in India would have to be re examined. The impact of classifying denotified tribes. How many denotified tribes, nomadic tribes have been comprehensively categorized by the Anthropological Survey of India and tribal research institutes? What will be the impact on SC, ST, and OBC reservations? How many communities were classified for the first time ever? The Anthropological Survey of India, ANSI, and tribal research institutes across the country have for the first time comprehensively categorized 268 denotified semi-nomadic and nomadic tribes that were thought to have never been classified before. After the 3-year study, the ANSI and TRIs have recommended the inclusion of 179 of these communities in the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes list. At least 85 of these communities are being recommended for a classification for the first time ever. The study also found that 63 communities that have never been classified were not traceable anymore, meaning that they likely assimilated into larger communities, changed their names, or migrated to other states. Ever since the Criminal Tribes Act of 1924, which was repealed in August 1949, after which communities notified as criminal had been denotified, successive commissions have tried to classify these communities, starting with the first Backward Classes Commission headed by Kaka Kelkar. Since then, the Lokur Committee 1965, Mandal Commission 1980, Renke Commission 2008, and the Idate Commission 2017 have tried to classify such tribes across the country. However, they have fallen short of being able to identify such circumstance communities. The last commission tasked with with this was one headed by Bhikuji Ramji Idate, which submitted its report on December 2017. In its report, it had listed a total of 1,200 denotified semi-nomadic and nomadic tribes across the country, apart from which it said there were 267 communities that had been classified. Idate Commission's report has noted that previous commissions had never been able to classify these communities, recommending strongly that the classification would be completed as soon as possible. To this end, the Prime Minister's office constituted a special committee in February 2019, headed by Vice Chairperson of the Niti Aayog, consisting of Mr. Idate, Dr. J.K. Bajaj of the Center of Policy Institute Studies, and the Director General of ANSI as members. This committee gave the work of classification to the ANSI and TRIs, which began work on the project in February 2020, submitting a report in August 2023. The Parliamentary Standing Committee on Social Justice and Empowerment had in a December 2022 report said it had repeatedly flagged that the government's inability to take necessary action on the speedy categorization of these communities. Delay in locating them would increase their suffering and they would not be able to get benefits of prevailing schemes meant for the welfare of SCs and STs. S. Narayan, Professor Emeritus at the Institute of Social Sciences in New Delhi, pointed out that the issue with wrong categorization began with some of the first censuses ever conducted by colonial administrators. There were many instances of tribe being classified as caste and vice versa. Many of it may have political considerations behind it, and this continued after independence as well. He added that while the act of including communities in ST/ST OBC list may be political, when one applies an anthropological lens to it, the classifications are bound to be different. Further, community activists and experts like Dr. B.K. Lodhi, who also assisted the Idat Commission in his work, said in the absence of a complete list of denotified semi-nomadic and nomadic communities across the country, it has been very difficult to organize the communities and its people. Some of are classified as SC, ST, OBC. Some of this is also incorrect, and beyond this, there are hundreds that have not been classified. Now that almost all denotified nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes are closer to being classified than ever before, one impact that has been political, community activists across UP, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh and Gujarat are pushing hard to question the premise of classifying these communities as SC, ST, OBC all together with an eye on reservations. With the development of welfare board for denotified nomadic and semi-nomadic communities, there are two strands of thought. One calls for the completion of classification process that so that all denotified nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes get benefits meant for them as per the classification of SC, ST and OBC, including that of reservation. The other calls for creating a separate classification altogether for denotified tribes in the form of schedule in the constitution. Secondly, depending on what action the government takes on the recommendations of this study, it will make it easier for the state governments to initiate the process of inclusion if they so decide to do it. While the ANSI and TRIs have completed the ethnographic study, the report remains with the special committee headed by the chairperson of the Niti Aayog. Officials have said that the committee is now scrutinizing the recommendations and will soon prepare a final report. Is Trump's order on birthright citizenship constitutional? What does the 14th Amendment of the Constitution state? Birthright citizenship is legal principle that grants automatic citizenship to individuals born within a country's territory. In US, the right is enshrined in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. US District Judge John Connor issued a temporary restraining order halting the enforcement of executive order nationwide. He described the order as blatantly unconstitutional. Nations worldwide largely determine citizenship through two principles: jus soli, right of the soil, which grants citizenship by birthplace, or jus sanguinis, right of blood, which grants it by familial descent. Jus soli and jus sanguinis, right of the soil and right of blood. Right of the soil and right of blood. So that's all. See you in the next one.